Welcome to the Treasury Update Podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in. On this episode of the podcast, host Craig Jeffery sits down with CTMfile founder and editor Jack Large to discuss important Treasury news, developments, and resources. Listen in as they dive into the latest Treasury trends and their new work together.
Hello, Jack. Welcome to the Treasury Update Podcast.
Good to be here.
Some of the listeners to the Treasury Update Podcast may not be familiar with CTMfile, found at CTMfile.com. Some may be familiar, others may not. And I was wondering if you could give us a brief overview of CTMfile. What is CTMfile?
CTMfile stands for Cash and Treasury Management File. And the reason we chose file is because essentially what we wanted to develop was a database of all sorts of different items. And so each of the items that's recorded doesn't go away. It gets stored in various ways. So you can access it through searches and so on. And the other reason was that we felt that we needed a database, come file, come website that caters for not only the senior guys who just want the latest key topics and news, but also the more junior guys who need to learn the business. So not only are we recording the latest items, we have built the structures so that we give an intro to each of the topics in each of the sections. So I have friends who are corporate treasurers, and they say when I get somebody to join the department who's junior, they say, go and read CTMfile and learn the business. And then you can, as you get familiar, less and less you focus on the explanation items, but you refocus on the newer topics, the new items that are getting to the essence of what's happening in the business. And already we've got over 7,000 items in the database, and it's growing all the time. Inevitably, because I've now joined with a much bigger team, Strategic Treasurer, who have more than doubled the resources and are enabling us to give a wider coverage and depth, as you'll see over the coming months.
So Jack, as you mentioned, we joined forces and we put resources in there, but what was it? Just the additional resources as a reason for connecting together, for CTM and Strategic Treasurer coming together?
It's a complementary sort of work that we do. You do much more detailed reports and analyses, but we do short, sharp things right across the industry. And we don't care whether it occurs in Brazil or it occurs in Australia or in Europe or in the Far East. It's just bringing together what items are essential for you to keep up to date and know what's going on inside Treasury, which is, as you know, is growing. The expanse and the range of things that Treasury touches now is going bigger and bigger all the time.
The way you were describing CTMfile is this file. It's a Treasury news site for current items as well as a content site. So Treasury news and content. And there's a number of things that are pretty unique on CTMfile. And maybe you could just share what are some of those activities or methods of providing information through the CTMfile platform.
One of the things we do is we talk direct to senior players in the business, and we just have a chat about, a web chat as we call it, about what's going on in a particular area. So, for example, we've got coming out next week a web chat with a guy from foreign exchange in Deutsche Bank about what's the essence of automation, Treasury automation, and how you manage the balance between expertise, which is from the individual, and the balance of the automation. You quite rightly summed it up as doing automation right. Similarly, we've done a web chat again, which will be coming out next week, on what's the essence of cash flow forecasting. What are the three things that cash flow forecasting is really all about? And that's really where we focus. It's focusing on what things are all about. Now, we do it with web chats, we do it with reviews of different reports, we do it in a whole number of different ways. And then occasionally we'll do webinars, and we don't want to drone on about all the way through a normal presentation. We tend to focus on the key points in the development of an area. So it's unique perspective, I think, is maybe the way we talk about what we do.
There's a few things you said I wanted to jump in on a little bit. You talked about web chats, and for those that may be North American focused, that phrase is not quite as common as maybe a description is useful for that. It seems like it's those discussions you have that CTMfile has with different companies. It's like a recording. It is a recording of a discussion. There might be some slides or some type of demo where you listen in on the conversation and you can see what's transpiring, and it's focused, it's fast, and it's relevant.
Yeah, and we have various rules, like you're not allowed 20 slides, which you flip through. It's 4 or 5 slides, so you can't concentrate on the essence of the problem, on the solution. We actually re-record some of them when they're not focused enough, and we don't waste people's time. These web chats are not only focused, but we also give times when each of the topics appear. So if only one piece of a web chat is of interest, you can go direct to that, and you don't need to listen for another 10 minutes just to get to the 3-minute piece that you're interested in. It's for busy corporate treasury people, regardless of whether senior or junior.
The other aspect is on a bi-weekly basis. Currently, there's a new podcast, or a newly named podcast, Open Treasury, which is available through anywhere you get your podcast. So Open Treasury. What's covered on that typically?
Well, we take, over the last 2 weeks, the few items, and it's never more than 5, that were key during the last 2 weeks, and we discuss them and we look at what's the impact of it, what does it mean, as well as giving the reference to the links to each of the items in CTMfile. We discuss the actual topic itself and saying, well, what does this mean? Why is this important? So, for example, we talked about the central bank digital currencies and when and why they're going to be important. We talked about new developments in ESG in terms of monitoring and controlling. We talked about different aspects of payment systems that have become relevant. The changing field is changing all the time. And what's really interesting is there are trends coming through that are coming through right across the business. It doesn't matter whether it's foreign exchange, whether it's treasury systems, or whether it's risk management. There are key things coming through, and we focus on those.
Yeah, and thank you for having me as a guest on those quite frequently. I definitely enjoy talking through those with you. And so for those of you who are listening, in the show notes, you can find a way to access the Open Treasury podcast. We invite you to subscribe there. CTMfile also has a bi-weekly email that will send out a summary of different news content and information that's relevant. We invite you to subscribe there as well. Jack, as we continue talking on this, the CTMfile is a Treasury news and resource site, content site for Treasury. You described the situation of some treasurers. They have someone new come into the department. They use it to get them caught up on the industry at large. Are there other ways that this supports Treasury and financial professionals that maybe we haven't covered so far?
I can only look at it in terms of what's coming in the future, what we are focusing on in different ways, and we've got initiatives show how we're developing the topic. I mean, for example, we've got a whole new series on the new thing coming out of one of our associate members, which is the ability to monitor in real time how workers are in a supply chain are behaving, what they're thinking. Now, this is groundbreaking stuff, and it changes the way people look at problems. And we're starting to see that sort of thing, and we've had an article this week on it. We've got web chats next week, and we're going to follow it with a webinar and so on. Similarly, we are focusing on what's happened over the last 12 months in our what my true love brought to me on the 12 days of Christmas. That will show what happened in the past, but also give hints about what's coming in the future. And another one that I pick up on is how people are starting to realize what they have to do is focus and have a way of looking at where they're going. So we will be doing more and more on vision for Treasury in all sorts of different ways. And finally, we're looking at something else that's emerging, which is an increasing understanding that what you're buying when you get a relationship with a treasury management system provider or a bank is you're buying into their ecosystem, the bank's ecosystem or the treasury's ecosystem. And what you're doing is melding those together with yours to provide your total ecosystem. And what's interesting for me is that we're going to see much more focus on this. Ecosystems are my event for 2022, sorry.
Jack, thanks for that response and the details. The vision for Treasury, ecosystem, the power of networks, both technologically and the broader connections are really significant topics in the era of open banking, open treasury. I think those are really spot on. I appreciate you bringing those up. But as we finish out the podcast, do you have any final thoughts to share about CTMfile or Treasury in general?
One big problem is not to be boring, because there's so much repetition. What we have been focusing on, and we will focus on, is not being boring. Reporting on the significant, interesting items that are going to make a difference, and looking at the essence of the solutions.
I always appreciate your no-nonsense look and comments on things. I find it refreshing, just like you probably like my American accent and take on English soccer, which you like to call football.
Oh, don't talk to me about soccer. My team lost today.
Okay, so sorry about that. Jack, thanks so much for your time and for all our listeners out there to tap into these resources. We encourage you to look at CTMfile.com. That's in the show notes as you go there and subscribe. And also, go ahead and subscribe to the Open Treasury Podcast. Right now, it just comes out every couple of weeks. Perhaps that will increase in the future, but we're enjoying this 2-week recap and ask that you also join that separate podcast channel. Jack, thanks so much for talking with me today.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update Podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.